Rape accusations against a pop star has pushed China's Me Too movement back into the spotlight. In early August, police in Beijing detained Kris Wu, a dual Chinese-Canadian citizen, on suspicion of rape. 30-year-old Wu originally rose to fame as part of the Chinese-Korean boy band EXO. Over the past decade, he's gone solo as a singer and model, amassing an online following of millions of fans and endorsement contracts with top luxury brands. He's the most famous man to be detained over Me Too accusations in China. Joining us in the studio is Michelle Stockman, who has been following the story for DW News Asia. Michelle, tell us a little bit more about the accusations.
Okay. So Kris Wu's accuser is an 18-year-old Beijing college student. Her name is Zhu. She says that last December, Kris Wu's agent invited her to Kris Wu's house in Beijing. She says when she was there, she was pressured to drink excessively. She says she passed out. Kris Wu had sex with her, and then she woke up in bed. She says the two of them then dated for 3 months until he stopped returning her phone calls and messages, essentially ghosting her.
And I want to hone in on that, because we see this a pattern a lot where rape victims date their perpetrator. I mean, it seems very counterintuitive.
Absolutely, it seems counterintuitive. Conventional wisdom would say a woman might go into fight or flight mode when she's faced with her rapist, but researchers say that's not always the response women have. Sometimes they freeze up, sometimes they try to appease their rapist, sometimes they deny it even happened so they don't feel like a victim.
And so when did this case become public?
Okay, so his accuser went public in mid-July, a few months after they supposedly broke up. And she went on a talk show. She shared private messages that she says back up her account of what happened. And she says she is among a string of young women that Kris Wu targeted, promised career opportunities to, and then sexually assaulted. And there have been other women that have come forward publicly.
Do you know how the police responded over this case?
Well, they initially responded in the way that many women in China who come forward with Me Too accusations say they are treated. She was treated with skepticism and denial and pushback. So, actually, when the police were investigating the case in July, they released a statement saying that she hyped up the case, her story, in order to gain more online popularity.
I mean, not necessarily all good popularity. I mean, she probably got a lot more incoming negative. I mean, this is going to follow her throughout her career and stuff.
Yeah, Melissa, there was both. There was a huge outpouring of support for her. There was kind of a grassroots movement to boycott the brands that were linked to Kris Wu that ultimately cut ties with him. But then, you know, he has millions, tens of millions of fans who attacked her online, and there was a bunch of victim shaming. You know, the state propaganda outlets were also pretty quiet around this story until Kris Wu was actually detained by police, and then they published a lot of commentary condemning him. But it's important to note that the charges against him of suspected rape, it's unclear whether it's linked to Ms. Du's case or if it's resulted from further investigation by police.
Now, the very fact that the police has detained him, is this a signal of a step forward for the Me Too movement in China?
You know, Melissa, it could be, but we have to look at some recent cases. About 3 years ago, there was a case where a young woman accused a TV anchor of groping her in his dressing room. And she was told, oh, hush it up, he's a symbol of the state. It would bring shame on the state if you make this public. And she's now facing a defamation lawsuit. But just this week, Alibaba, tech giant, there was a manager that a female staffer accused of pressuring her to drink, of raping her. He was fired along with several executives. So it could be that we're seeing prominent men apparently being held accountable for their bad behavior. But there is reason for cynicism. The Chinese state is very suspicious of the celebrity culture that's erupted around these pop stars. They're afraid they can't control it. They're afraid it's promoting materialism and individualism rather than, say, duty to the state. So it may be that Kris Wu makes a convenient target for the Chinese state to say, watch out, seeking fame can be a problem for you, rather than saying, hey, women, we know what's going on. We're going to try and fundamentally change the way you're treated.
Right. So it's less about protecting women's rights and possibly more about maintaining state power.
I mean, gotta look at both sides of the coin here.
I mean, Mao Zedong did say women hold up half the sky, but it's interesting where things stand in China today. Thanks so much, Michelle.
You're very welcome.
A family in shock and grief. 77-year-old Amna is devastated by how her daughter's life was suddenly cut short. She tells us that of all her children, Horatulan, or Annie as she was called, was the closest to her. She was a loving daughter and a mother of 4 children, with a degree in business administration, she says. In these wedding pictures, Annie looks full of joy, but her husband turned out to be a violent, abusive man who often assaulted her during their 10-year marriage. On the night of July 15th, her husband started beating her in a fit of rage. This time, it proved fatal. 5 days after Annie's murder, another young woman, Noor Muqaddam, was assaulted and beheaded by a male acquaintance in the capital, Islamabad. The atrocity took place in an upscale neighborhood and shook the country's educated class. In both cases, the alleged perpetrators were arrested, but it did little to stop violence against women. Civil society activists say the frequency and brutality of cases is growing. The problem is our patriarchal system, she says. It shapes our state institutions. It breeds toxic masculinity and normalizes violence against women. In most cases, she says, culprits literally get away with murder. If they are rich, they pressurize victims' families to take blood money in exchange for dropping the charges. That, she says, needs to change. Officials say change may be slow, but it is taking place. A recent initiative by provincial police with an all-female staff encourages women to report gender-based violence. Survivors can file a complaint by calling a helpline or by visiting the local women protection cell.
This initiative, I would say, saving lives.
Tell that to Annie's 8-year-old daughter, who saw their mother getting beaten to death. Or explain it to Annie's 18-year-old sister, Zara, who's now looking after her sister's children.
It makes me sad, it makes me angry, it makes me hopeless. So many cases go unreported, but then again, I have some hope that maybe someday the justice will be served for the victims.
Unless that happens, Pakistan will be counting more and more crimes against women.
Joining us is Zara Haider, who frequently writes about women in Pakistan and gender-based violence, and you have a personal connection to one of the women from the report. Noor Muqaddam, murdered recently, was a childhood friend, and you've taken to social media to talk about this. Tell us what you've been saying.
Yes. Regarding Noor's murder, I felt that it was important to highlight it as much as possible to create as much awareness as possible, given that, of course, what's happened is, well, to call it a tragedy is an understatement, but also because it is personal to me and it hits home very closely. Her killer as well, Zahir Jaffer, is somebody that I also grew up with, is an old childhood friend of mine. And I know how wealthy and privileged and well-connected his family is. And, it is commonplace for such families in Pakistan to be able to, I suppose, get out of these situations. So my intention was just to use my connections and my privilege to ensure that I could, ensure that I could gain as much correct information as possible and share it.
And of course, he's an alleged murderer. He has to go through the judicial system. Do you have confidence in Pakistan's justice system? It doesn't sound like you do.
I mean, personally, given, I suppose, just the socio-cultural context, the historical context of Pakistan's judicial system, also as someone who grew up in this privileged and wealthy class, the elite class, and have witnessed, people get away with murder multiple times in the past, I unfortunately do not have that much hope, but I'm really, really hoping that this is a revolutionary moment in history.
What is the climate in the country? What has been the reaction to her murder? Are people so misogynistic you've had some justify her death?
Yes, unfortunately, this happens a lot. There is a very large culture of survivor shaming or victim blaming in Pakistan, and a lot of it has to do with a fundamentalist religious mentality, and it's always sort of blamed on the woman. It's kind of everything is just sort of gravitated and blamed onto the woman. This just happens to be just how the socio-religious cultural context is.
And now, I'm a little curious, have things gotten worse in recent years? I think we tend to think that we're in the 21st century and it's got to be better than the 20th century. But you have some leadership. You have a climate that appears to be worse based on the news that I've certainly read. What are your thoughts on that?
The reality is that the world is still incredibly patriarchal, and Pakistan is no exception. Pakistan, I fear, is perhaps, excessively patriarchal in certain contexts. I think that it is because of this male-dominated system that refuses to evolve or allow space for other voices, and I think that really requires reform, especially in Pakistan, given the current climate.
Zara Haider, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.